Contented Media presents Dr. Bitcoin, the man who wasn't Satoshi Nakamoto, an original podcast series with Mark Hunter and Arthur Van Pelt.
Hello and welcome to Dr. Bitcoin, the man who wasn't Satoshi Nakamoto, and part 3 in our COPA vs Craig Wright special series. So far, we've covered the genesis of the case, which started when Craig Wright sent cease and desist letters to various companies over their hosting of the Bitcoin white paper in early 2021, 4 months after COPA was formed, and in part 2, we looked at the opening skirmishes over Wright's evidence, giving us an idea of what we might be in for. We also learned that all Wright's UK court cases that concern his identity as Satoshi, all bar the Hodlonaut libel case, were to be wrapped up in an identity issue trial, a preliminary trial that would decide the fate of not just the COPA case, but these 4 other cases too. In this episode, we'll cover Wright's replies to some of COPA's questions over his 2016 signing sessions, do a deep dive into some of the best revelations from the Madden report, and take a look at a critical addition to COPA's claim that could see Craig Wright in a whole heap of trouble. Now, that slavering sound you can hear behind me is Arthur Van Pelt with the Madden report, waiting to tear into it like a werewolf in a crowded lift. Arthur, can you hold off for a few more minutes?
Yes, sir. Sorry, Mark, of course.
Not long. We'll get there in time.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. Hey, thanks for having me, Mark.
A pleasure as always. We left part 2 in early October 2023, with the COPA vs Craig Wright trial now wrapped up in an all-encompassing identity issue trial which would determine the fate of this and several other cases. Craig Wright's camp had also been rocked by allegations from Christian Ager Hansen, some of which he has since deleted for legal reasons, that Calvin Ayre was no longer willing to back Craig Wright financially, having finally come to the conclusion that Craig Wright's Satoshi evidence, especially that discovered for the COPA trial, was as legitimate as a BSV transaction spike. Craig Wright, incidentally, has disputed all the claims made by Christian Ager Hansen. We also learned, for the first time, about the 970-page Madden report, which promised to destroy Wright's newly found evidence that he wrote the Bitcoin white paper. We had already gotten hints of what might be contained in the Madden report, but we were about to learn a whole lot more. Wright had also been ordered to answer more than 60 questions by COPA that he had so far failed to address, some dating back to the filing of the suit in 2021, by the 3rd week in October. These would be answered through Wright's witness statements and would address certain questions that we, among others, have been dying to know the answers to for some time. Arthur, before we go any further, we need to address something quite important, and this is how the shift to the identity ruling has impacted the way the judge will deal with the case. With the original COPA vs Craig Wright case, it would have been up to COPA to prove a negative, that Craig Wright wasn't the author of the Bitcoin white paper. In that instance, all Craig Wright had to do was put a little bit of doubt in the judge's mind that they were wrong, and he would have been victorious. But with the identity trial, this has changed, hasn't it?
Yes, it did. There was a direction from Justice Meller, and I better read it. For the purpose of the joint trial, the defendant in the COPA claim and the claimants to the BTC core claim, Dr. Wright, Wright International Investments Limited and Wright International Investments UK Limited, shall be known as the claimants. Dr. Wright is now a claimant. He was a defendant, he has now become the claimant. Mm-hmm. The other parties participating in the joint trial, which are COPA and the 1st to the 15th and the 17th and the 19th and the 20th defendants in the BTC core claim, shall be known as the defendants. Now, so please try to remember, Craig is now a claimant, COPA is now a defendant in this whole thing. Mm. The consequence of this flipping of defendant and claimant, it means the burden of proof has also changed somewhat. And I will allow one of our friends and one of our online friends to explain that. He said COPA doesn't have to prove anything in the trial of the preliminary issue. The burden is now on fake Toshi, which is Craig Wright, of course. All COPA has to do is challenge the evidence that Satoshi relies on to show that it proves nothing except that Craig Wright is a liar and a fraud. And the BSV crowd who claimed that COPA must prove a negative were right. They are not right anymore. The burden of proof in the original claim was firmly on COPA, and this meant proving a negative, which is not impossible, but more difficult than proving a positive. However, the burden of proof has been reversed for the trial of the preliminary issue, not least because Satoshi, Craig Wright, is the claimant in the majority of cases whose outcome depends on the identity issue. And therefore, the BSVers are no longer right to say that COPA must prove a negative. Instead, Satoshi will have to prove a positive.
And what interests me here is the fact that Craig Wright said that he pushed for this. He was really glad that this was the case. But he's just put the onus back on himself with this, hasn't he?
Yeah, exactly.
Patrick Madden handed his report to COPA in August, which in turn was handed to Wright's team for their comment on September the 1st, after which Wright, Calvin Ayre, Stephen Matthews and others went very quiet on the COPA case on social media. This was followed by Wright finding those extra hard drives containing barrel loads of freshly dug evidence, but with the trial date looming, it was touch and go whether they would be allowed into evidence. On October 6, 2023, law firm Shoesmiths took over Wright's COPA affairs after Travers Smith ended its 3-month association with Wright, making this the third law firm to represent him in this case, and in fact this year alone, following Ontier getting the boot, or leaving voluntarily, we're not sure, in June. This was a few weeks after Wright had been interviewed by Matt Green, the Shoesmiths blockchain litigation lead, in which Wright claimed that he'd been discussing selling Bitcoin to Microsoft in 2008, but that they weren't interested because the white paper wasn't ready yet. 3 days later, Wright submitted his second witness statement, which Justice Mellor had ordered should answer COPA's questions regarding the failed 2016 block signings and the ownership of the private keys to those blocks. As we found out in Part 2, Wright had been studiously avoiding answering these questions, leading to Justice Mellor forcing him to do so. In his witness statement, Wright confirmed that he had signed a message using a private key from one of the first handful of Bitcoin blocks for Rory Cellan-Jones from the BBC, Ludwig Ziegler from The Economist, John Matonis and Gavin Andresen. Wright then went on to explain the 2016 signing sessions in more detail than he has ever done before. For the journalists, Wright said he used his Eurocom laptop, which was, quote, especially configured to run on 2 separate operating systems, unquote, a Windows 10 Enterprise system and a Linux CentOS 7 environment. Wright had downloaded the Bitcoin Core software on both operating systems and says that he signed a message with the text of Jean-Paul Sartre's famous Nobel Prize rejection speech using the private key for Block 9, signing on the Windows environment and copying the resultant signature string over to the Linux version of Bitcoin Core where he verified the message. The same method was used for John Matonis, but then, of course, we have a different approach taken with Gavin Andresen. Arthur, remind us why Wright has to be more careful with the Gavin Andresen story.
Well, I think the main reason that Craig Wright has to be somewhat more truthful in his testimony about him signing for Gavin Andresen is that a lot of that proof session has been documented, almost from minute to minute. For example, in several depositions in the Climate versus Wright lawsuit, when both Craig Wright and Gavin Andresen were questioned about the signing, but also in 2016 already, when Andrew O'Hagan described the signing in his long-form The Satoshi Affair.
It seems, however, that Wright hasn't been careful enough. He says that it was Andresen who, quote, took the lead, unquote, in setting up the newly bought laptop, adding that once all the usual Windows gumph was installed, Andresen, quote, began by downloading Electrum directly from the official website, unquote, which he then installed. Wright adds that, quote, I cannot with certainty specify the exact version of Electrum that Gavin installed. All I'm sure of is that he sourced it directly from the official Electrum website, ensuring its authenticity and security, unquote. Arthur, why is this an important detail?
Well, this is rather crucial information, Mark, because on the 3rd of May in 2016, Electrum, themselves, they tweeted a message, and that goes completely against Craig's claim actually. What they tweeted was there was no download of a signature file of Electrum, a .asc file from a United Kingdom IP address on April the 7th. Now this is quite damning evidence, of course. That means that the Electrum wallet that they used during the signing with Gavin Andresen did not come from Electrum themselves. So Craig's testimony about it is incorrect, I'm afraid.
Wright says Andresen was in charge of everything, quote, to ensure that the process was transparent and could be held accountable, unquote. Indeed, Wright was very keen to stress that, quote, it was Gavin who selected the machine and it was Gavin who set it up. This ensured he was in control of the process, unquote. Now let's compare this with Gavin Andresen's recollection from his deposition in the Kleiman versus Wright trial. Quote, I do recall producing a brand new USB stick. I had my laptop with me and I put a brand new sealed in the package USB stick on the table, which I expected Craig to take and produce some digital signatures that I could then verify on my laptop. That did not happen. Instead, a brand new laptop was procured by an assistant. Craig and I waited in the room while the laptop was purchased. It was then unpacked and booted up for the first time in front of me, and the proof then was Craig downloaded and installed software, unquote. Arthur, here we have Craig Wright saying that Gavin Andresen loaded everything up and Gavin Andresen saying that in fact someone else did it for him. One of them is lying. Which has the most to gain out of lying about this?
Well, Craig Wright, Mark, no doubt about it. Many people have been questioning Gavin over the years as to who did what in that signing session, and the reason is that there is only one way it could be considered legitimate. If Craig Wright didn't touch the machine until it came time to sign the message. So on one hand, we have Gavin Andresen, who has no reason to lie, telling us that Craig downloaded what he needed on the machine, and Craig who needs to counter Gavin's statement to make sure that his story stands up. And if we talk about who has the greater incentive here, that is of course Craig Wright.
Wright says that he created the signature using Electrum on the Linux portion of his laptop, on which he said he had used best practice when installing it to make sure it wasn't compromised, before the signature string was transferred to the new laptop using Andresen's USB stick. Wright, after initially failing, eventually received the verified message, at which point Andresen believed Wright had proved his credentials. For more detail on this, see Series 1 Episodes 3 and 4 of this here podcast. Following the session, Wright says he gave the laptop and USB drive to the son of his wife, Ramona Watts, who formatted everything into oblivion, ensuring no external verification would ever be possible, which was the same approach he took with the journalists when he gave them the USB sticks not with the signature string for their own verification, but with a bunch of meaningless files, as one recipient, Rory Kethlin-Jones, explained to me when I interviewed him last year.
We were given a USB stick to take away afterwards, and we took it home, had a look at it, and were none the wiser.
So they didn't tell you how to go ahead and prove it yourself?
No, there was sort of Chinese whispers with him telling, I presume telling them and them telling me, but it was not at all clear.
We'll save Wright's version of events for the days that followed for another time, possibly a book or two, but we'll touch briefly on how he says he got the keys to sign in the first place. Wright says that as part of his scorched earth Satoshi policy in 2011, he put, quote, a significant volume of data, unquote, including the private keys to multiple Bitcoin addresses, onto a hard drive, the access to which he protected with a 15-slice Shamir sharing scheme. Some of the keys were given to Wright's trusted lieutenants, including Dave Kleiman, of course, Ian Wynne, of course, and Dennis Miyaka, of course. Crucially, though, Wright retained enough keys for him to be able to reconstruct the drive at will, naturally. Wright says he, quote, also obtained authorization from the trust to carry out the digital signature process, unquote. Arthur, I'm assuming we have plenty of emails between these four people and the trustees confirming their roles, responsibilities, and how and when to get the keys back to Craig Wright and everything like that.
Yeah, no.
Surprise!
No, we don't. Although I do remember there were one or maybe two emails in the Kleiman versus Wright docket who were sent by Win-Win to Gavin Andresen and Craig Wright, And I vaguely remember that they discussed Shamir slices and things like that to unlock the private keys. And there was also a limited consent and indemnity contract between Craig Wright and Denis Mayaka, who appears to be the only person to have signed that contract, of Equator Consultants AG on the Seychelles. So yeah, that whole material is far from complete, and it are all, mostly forgeries and inconsistent / wrong information.
And I find this amazing because the complexity needed to carry out what Craig Wright has suggested, you can't do all that with phone calls. That's impossible. You need things written down in advance. You need processes and who's doing what and making sure things are done in the right order. You can't tell me he's done all that over the phone and there's nothing written down at all. It's just absolutely impossible.
Yeah, exactly.
COPA also wanted more details on Craig Wright's famous claim during the Hodlonaut trial that he, quote, stomped on the hard drive, unquote, containing the private keys after the signing sessions. And we got them. In his witness statement, Wright said that he, quote, threw the hard drive with enough force to shatter the glass platters in the hard drive, unquote, which he says destroyed the physical components of the drive and rendered the data stored on it irretrievable. Wright blamed this action on his autism, claiming he felt deceived by Robert McGregor and the others who had pushed him towards the 2016 signing sessions, which, quote, triggered a heightened emotional response that clouded my judgment, unquote, and led him to, quote, impulsively destroy the hard drive without fully contemplating the long-term consequences, unquote. However, this action isn't quite as spontaneous as it might seem. During testimony for the Kleiman case in 2019, Wright said that in 2011 he had wanted to destroy the self-same hard drive, or at least the one containing the exact same data, with a hammer as part of his Satoshi scorched earth policy, but that Dave Kleiman had persuaded him not to. So this spontaneous action had in fact first crossed his mind 5 years previously. Nice try. On October the 16th, Wright filed his third witness statement, which tackled the issue of a credit card payment COPA said Wright had used in 2019 to try and convince Jimmy Wynn that he was Satoshi. This was related to a claim Wright had made in an April 2019 blog post covering the origins of Bitcoin.org, in which Wright said, quote, what you don't realise yet is that I used my credit card. Yes, as crazy as it might seem to you, I used my credit card to purchase anonymous services. I even claimed it on my tax. I had an argument with the tax office in Australia about claiming it, unquote. Wright had added that, quote, the records of the same payment are required to be kept by the banking system for 25 years. It hasn't been that long, unquote. It must have been pretty easy, therefore, for Wright to just request these bank records and prove the purchase once and for all. This, it seems, he did, with COPA recovering an email Wright sent to Wynn in June 2019 containing 2 screenshots of National Bank of Australia, NBA, transactions covering the purchase, along with, quote, text written by Dr. Wright apparently intended to persuade the recipient that the information is supportive of his claim to be Satoshi Nakamoto, unquote. COPA's story was that Wright fabricated the screenshots in an attempt to hoodwink Wynn and hid the actual screenshots during disclosure, only providing them once Patrick Madden had debunked the ones sent to Jimmy Wynn. Wright's story, however, was different. Wright said that the screenshots hadn't originated from him, but that one of his lawyers for the Kleiman trial, Amanda McGovern, had received them through, and I quote, a direct message from a pseudonymous Reddit user whose identity remains undisclosed. Wright added that he had sent them to Wynn not to use as proof of his Satoshi claim, but instead to get a second opinion on his initial belief that the screenshots were fakes, with his lack of faith in their authenticity being the reason why they weren't disclosed in the Kleiman trial. Wright added that he did not have access to his account at the time the screenshots were taken, and that the version of the NAB website did not exist at the time his account was active. However, COPA argued that the email to Wynn was clearly an attempt by Wright to use the screenshots in the capacity they alleged, and indeed, it seems odd that Wright would email Jimmy Wynn, quote, to check, unquote, their authenticity when he apparently knew for certain they couldn't have originated from him. COPA also noted that Wright hadn't come up with his story until Patrick Madden had debunked the screenshots, and added that Wright possessed, but did not disclose as he should have done, identical screenshots from the same account that showed no such transaction taking place, instead disclosing just the fake ones. Now how did he get hold of those? Arthur, what can we even say at this point?
Yeah, these things are so cringe, aren't they? First, the screenshot in his blog post in April 2019 that was called out by the Bitcoin community as a forgery already. And then in June 2019, a few other screenshots that end up in the COPA case that are found forgeries with an inconceivable story about an anonymous Reddit user. I mean, mind you, Craig Wright is even involving a lawyer in his story that has passed away since. And not many know this probably, but Amanda McGovern passed away on April the 22nd of 2023 due to cancer. And of course we know that Craig Wright is frequently using people who have passed away to further his claims because they cannot argue against him. Although of course you never find his claims backed up with any evidence anyway. But yeah, this idea that some random person on Reddit sent his own bank statement to his lawyer for a different trial, I mean, yeah, sorry, but this is just too crazy to take seriously. And the reason why he does it, though, is to muddy the waters over his chain of custody. If he can suggest that they never came from him, yeah, then he can't be found guilty of submitting forged evidence. Then it's the fault of the lawyer or this random Redditor in this case.
Foolproof, absolutely foolproof.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine being a judge reading this type of stories? This is so inconceivable.
Yeah.
This will backfire in a mega way, I think.
In a final flourish to this odd story, Wright withdrew the screenshots as evidence and replaced them with the originals, which, in the words of COPA, quote, did not include any transaction supporting his claim to be Satoshi, unquote. One newly minted BSV vlogger, who clearly hadn't read any of the filings, believed that this was Wright's strategy over the Bitcoin.org bank records.
My prediction for what really is going to go on here is that Craig Wright's going to play sly, chill, like a fox, and he's somehow, some way, going to bring in a witness from the bank that held the purchase in 2008 for the Bitcoin.org website. That's what likely will happen. They would have all these certified records that they could authenticate, and it wouldn't be tampered with. It'd be like a sealed package, a sealed envelope of documents with bank records authenticated from the vice president of that bank saying, these are the records of the file at this time. Here's, shows them to the court, shows them to the other side. And then at that time, he says, yep, I was working at the bank at that time in 2008. And we had a client by the name of Dr. Craig Wright. And according to this record here, this transaction was sent to purchase this particular website as shown on Exhibit A here to the court.
Arthur, I'm having trouble holding myself together here. This guy, Gavin Mayle, who I think many of us are sadly going to be hearing from a lot in the coming weeks and months, he thinks that Craig Wright is going to, on the sly, get the vice president of Visa or MasterCard to personally vouch for and then hand over a bag of sealed bank records from 2008 that will show Craig Wright buying Bitcoin.org. What on earth can you say to that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I see several people, and people as in BSV fans, predicting this type of things. This is not the first time, and it will probably not be the last time. They all think that Craig Wright is some kind of a master 4D or 5D or 6D or whatever chess player, and that he will have several cards up his sleeves to turn the tides during the COPA trial. And yeah, after the not sending Bitcoin back to 3 people to save the signing sessions debacle in 2016, the rolling iceberg orders that never came, and the fatal segment flaw reveal that we are still waiting for.
Yep.
Bombshell Monday, you might remember Bombshell Monday.
Yes.
That was missed several times during, at least the Kleiman suit.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have the Terra node with terabyte blocks and 10 billion transactions per second that was announced for 2020 and 2021, 22, 23. So, yeah.
Endless list.
There will be no surprise witnesses bringing Craig his credit card payment proof in a sealed bag during trial, Mark. Mark my words.
Now, just a side note on this guy, this is why he's been flooding YouTube with pro-Craig Wright content.
I'll just be bold about it. It's my goal to get Sponsor to go and help with the reporting on this trial in January, whatever the dates are. So that's my intent. I'm putting it forward.
Gavin, here's a tip. Stick to nutrition. On October 23rd, Wright filed his fourth witness statement, which, 2 years after he had been asked, answered a number of questions over the Bitcoin white paper, software versions, and more that Justice Mellor had ordered him to provide. Wright revealed that he didn't keep records of who he had sent the white paper drafts to and when, despite listing the individuals by name, and often the year in which they received them, in testimony for prior cases. He did, however, list 21 people to whom he believed he sent the white paper in his own name, and 14 that received it from him as Satoshi Nakamoto. Arthur, obviously we don't know how many people Satoshi Nakamoto might have sent the white paper to in his own name, but we know of only 2 or 3 instances of him sending it to anyone, and those were under his pseudonym. What are the chances that he was, at the same time, flinging it around Australia under his own name?
Yeah, I would of course say 0% chance, because Craig Wright is making it all up and thinking about the real Satoshi, who was extremely cautious between 2008 and 2011 to remain anonymous, or pseudonymous, I have to say, of course. And it totally makes no sense that he would have made the mistake of sending the white paper to people revealing his own name. That would have become known already many, many years ago, I'm sure.
And it doesn't stop there. Wright says he also sent drafts to representatives from the Australian Stock Exchange, Rail Corp, News Limited, Hoyts, Centrebet, Sportingbet, and GSCU. He also apparently discussed the concepts of Bitcoin with teaching staff from Charles Sturt University, Newcastle University, and Northumbria University, and members of the Sands Institute, but he has no idea who. Wright added in his statement that he now could not recall exactly how he purchased the Bitcoin.org website, adding that he might have used Liberty Reserve dollars, of course, and added that, either way, his accounting records, submitted for evidence, would have the record on there. Oh good. Wright also submitted a video of him logging into the Satoshi Vista Mail account, the Bitcoin.org backend, and more, allegedly taken in 2019. He also noted that neither Ontier nor Travis Smith had included these videos in Discovery and couldn't understand why. Probably because they know best, Craig. Next, Wright turns to the famous upload of the Bitcoin white paper to SSRN in 2019, on which Wright had added date written August 21st, 2008, himself. This, he said, was never intended to be proof of him being Satoshi, but it was done because he, quote, considered it important that SSRN publish the final version of the white paper from 2019, unquote, adding that the upload should not be misconstrued as an unaltered native document from 2008. Heaven forfend! Wright then went on to claim that, quote, I created all versions of the Bitcoin software in the period between 2007 and its initial release in 2009, unquote, adding that, unfortunately, all the hardware involved had likely been decommissioned or destroyed, and he could no longer gain access to any of the online accounts used for this purpose during this time. On October the 24th, 3 weeks after Wright had submitted these answers, Justice Mellor handed down a ruling regarding a request by COPA to add 3 paragraphs to its particulars of claim. The basis of the claim was due to the following assertion. Quote, on several occasions when Dr. Wright has sought to prove he is Satoshi by way of documentary evidence, it has been shown that the documents he relies on are not what he claims they are, unquote. COPA gave 3 instances where Wright had offered proof that was far from the standard required to back up his claims. The first concerned Wright's reliance documents, which it said had been, quote, altered or otherwise tampered with, unquote, allegations that were laid out in the Madden report. The second was that Wright either did the tampering, ordered someone else to do the tampering, or, at the very least, knew that it was being carried out, given that no one else benefited from it. And the third was that Wright would rely on a, quote, history of plagiarism, unquote, which would demonstrate, quote, his propensity to take credit for work others have undertaken and pass it off as his own, unquote. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Wright, quote, vigorously resisted, unquote, the attempts to add the paragraphs, with Wright's counsel arguing that this was, quote, probably the most important application in the case to date, unquote. The issue took up a full day in court, with COPA arguing that it wouldn't know the extent of the forgery until it had received all of Wright's evidence, but that what it had seen so far was so obviously fake that it warranted these more serious charges. Arthur, Craig Wright gave 10 reasons why he shouldn't be accused of forgery. What were some of your highlights?
I had 2 of them. They all overlap a little bit, but the one that stand out for me is number 2. There is insufficient time from now until trial for Dr. Wright to be given a fair opportunity to respond to the vast number of new and very serious allegations raised by the proposed amendments. Yeah, who is to blame here?
Poor thing.
Yeah, of course. Now, and the other one was number 7. They are disproportionate because attempting to introduce a vast number of new allegations of forgery only a matter of months before trial goes well beyond what proportionally requires for the fair determination of the identity issue. Now, and it beats me. I mean, the identity issue is of course connected to try to be an identity that he isn't. So the more forgeries they find, the less the judge will be inclined to rule that he has that identity that he's trying to forge. Mm-hmm. So of course it's very relevant. And you know why I find this one hilarious, Mark? Because the main denominator to determine if Craig Wright is Satoshi, the identity issue of the case, is Craig's ability to come up with untampered, genuine evidence. And he simply cannot. Every batch of documents and other files that he hands over to substantiate that he is Satoshi Nakamoto is burned to the ground as being forged each and every time. So, of course, these repeated findings of forged material help paint a picture of who we are dealing with. Not Satoshi, but a serial forging cosplayer instead.
Wright underpinned his argument against the additional charges of forgery with 3 key points. Number 1, up till then, COPA's claim had been one of mere inauthenticity rather than outright fraud. Number 2, adding the claim would mean some 400 forgeries being analysed for fraud, with a defence of each also needed. And number 3, quote, the forgery amendments are not a proper pleading of forgery and fall foul of the principles relating to pleading fraud, unquote. In coming to his decision, Justice Mellor noted that the allegations, quote, were and remain serious allegations akin to fraud, unquote. Hooray! And then went on to outline what each party said in their submissions. COPA argued that both sides understood that its case involved allegations of dishonesty and systematic forgery by Craig Wright, so this shouldn't have come as a surprise, and gave several examples of times when Wright's various lawyers clearly understood the severity of the fraud involved. Wright's argument was not exactly a belter, as we learnt from the ruling. Quote, Dr. Wright contended that this definition was so broad that it robbed the term altered documents of any meaning. He also contended that this definition, quote, cannot amount to an allegation of forgery because it does not specify that the documents were altered by him nor that he altered them with the requisite subjective intent for an allegation of forgery, unquote. Wright also found issue with the fact that COPA was relying chiefly on the Madden report. Quote, Mr. Madden does not, or at least should not, make any findings of deliberate forgery at the hand of Dr. Wright. To the extent that he does so, he would be trespassing well beyond the proper bounds of his evidence, unquote. Justice Mellor's ruling also outlined the sheer variety of forgeries that Craig Wright had supposedly indulged in. These included many of the 107 documents put forward as evidence for the COPA trial and many from other court cases, communications sent to third parties retrieved from Wright's own sent email folder, handwritten documents, and accounting records and screenshots. In all these instances, COPA's lawyer said, the, quote, natural inference of the findings is that the alterations and tampering were by way of deliberate forgery and that this was carried out by Dr. Wright with his involvement or, at least, with his knowledge and consent, unquote. Arthur, we then got 6 bits of fraudulent evidence which gave us more of a flavour of what's in the Madden report, but there was one standout, wasn't there?
Oh yeah, there was a lot of good stuff, like the Blacknet documents and spoofed emails, but indeed the best was no doubt the internet banking screenshots, which purport to show Dr. Wright making a payment by credit card to anonymousspeech.com, and I'm quoting at the moment, a domain associated with an email known to have been used by Satoshi. By letter dated 27 of September 2023, Dr. Wright's previous solicitors Travers Smith LLP, admitted the internet banking screenshots in document 3455 were not authentic. At that point, no explanation was given as to how Dr. Wright came to disclose bank records from his own account, which were doctored apparently in support of his claims. End of quote.
Wright's counsel argued, predictably, that there wasn't enough time to go through all the 400 plus forgeries at trial, so they should just stick to the inauthentic avenue rather than adding new allegations of fraud into the mix. They also argued that it was too late in proceedings to be adding such a burden to the case, with Wright's lawyer using precedent from another case, Cobbold versus Greenwich LBC, to back up his point. Justice Mellor, however, was not exactly convinced of its merits. Quote, "I confess I was somewhat surprised to see the reliance on Cobbold, since I understood it was considered no longer good law." Unquote. Welcome to good law. Justice Mellor summarised that it would be, quote, disproportionate for the trial judge to have to decide around 400 allegations of forgery, unquote, and canvassed opinion from the two camps as to how many they thought should be allowed. Justice Mellor thought all reliance documents plus 20 others, making around 127. COPA wanted around 200, while Wright wanted 5. Yes, 5 out of 400. Arthur, where did Justice Mellor eventually fall with the number of forgeries allowed into trial?
Mellor ruled, and I'll quote again, "In the unusual circumstances before the court, I propose to take a somewhat unusual course in that I propose to give permission to amend in a form which is not before the court. I propose to allow COPA to plead forgery of a total of 50 additional documents." So they come on top of the other 6 already mentioned. "It is for COPA to identify the documents which they wish to include in the 50, and they must choose wisely, i.e. it may only be necessary to include some of the drafts of the white paper, some drafts of the Bitcoin software, and some documents which fall outside Dr. Wright's reliance documents." End of quote.
Justice Mellor allowed COPA's claim and added the forgery element, conceding that, with Wright having confirmed the authenticity of the documents, COPA should have the chance to challenge them to the highest level. Quote, "I consider that COPA should have the opportunity not just to challenge the authenticity of those and other documents, but to press the essential feature of their claim, that Dr. Wright's claim to be Satoshi is fraudulent, and, consistently with that, the documents he relies upon in support of that claim have been forged. This is the reason why I reject Dr. Wright's argument that these amendments are unnecessary. They represent the essential core of COPA's case. At the same time, Dr. Wright should have the opportunity to explain why COPA's challenges to his documents are wrong." Unquote. At this point, it's worth reminding ourselves of what Craig Wright said at an Oxford University talk in 2019.
Here's the thing. Evidence. We have courts. You know what happens when you lie in a court? You know the maximum penalty in this country for perjury? It's about 20 years. Great. I'm going to be in court. Prove it in court. You get to send me to jail for 20 years. I get to put my evidence and other people get to put theirs. That's how real things work in the real world. The real world, people have evidence and rules. People put documents out and get a chance to actually have them analysed properly.
Yes, they do. Arthur, this is a potentially very damaging addition that COPA managed to get added. Before this, the worst that could happen to Craig Wright was that he would not be allowed to call himself Satoshi in the UK, and he would have to pay COPA's costs as well. Now, though, he could be in pretty deep waters, couldn't he?
Oh yeah, for sure. Because Justice Mellor added a 3rd ruling to the list, and we already had 2 rulings that he will provide after the trial. The first one is Craig Satoshi, and the other one is, does Craig have any Bitcoin copyright? So that were the only basic rulings that he was supposed to do. But now there will be a 3rd ruling. Is Craig a fraud, dishonest, and serial forger? And these are the exact words that Mellor used throughout his ruling. So I put them together in one sentence. But basically, it means that it will be a ruling of, is Craig a fraud? And if that happens, there's a very real chance that he gets hit with a contempt of court charge. And you just played that clip from the Oxford University talk. In that little speech of his, he says, you get to put me away for 20 years if he's convicted of fraud. Well, here's to hoping, Mark.
Indeed. Justice Mellor denied Wright's claim that the difference between forgery and inauthentic was too large to warrant the additional charges, adding that, quote, COPA has all the material it needs to be able to plead clear allegations of forgery in line with the case law, unquote. One defeat that COPA did suffer, however, was that its plagiarism claims were not added to the charge sheet, with Justice Mellor ruling that the probative value was, quote, so slight, unquote, as to not warrant the trouble and the cost. COPA was given a week to file its amended particulars of claim in line with the ruling, and around this time we began to get a shift in tone from the BSV crowd, who had gone from sabre-rattling over Wright's inevitable victory to the potential for a defeat, but only because of one factor: a corrupt legal system.
All solicitors and barristers, not particularly the people that he has employed, are actually working as agents of the legal system. They are not asserting the rights of Craig in law.
Good. So he needs to go in there as a man of the living, if you like, to prove who he is, that he is alive and that he created Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you want some more? Go on then.
They're speaking a language called legalese, and Dr. Wright cannot speak legalese, so therefore even if he talks, he will not be heard. So the buildings that we think of as lawful courts are not there. These are actually a private business where the man dressed up as a judge and the man dressed up as barristers and solicitors and the guys on the other side are all working for the same private business. And the only, man there that's asserting his lawful rights is Craig.
Now, before you dismiss the speaker entirely, her name is Professor Dolores Cahill, a professor not of law, but instead in the field of immunology, whose other claims in the past include that COVID-19 can be prevented by taking a combination of vitamins, that the wearing of a face mask starves the body of oxygen and lowers the IQ of children, and that if anyone tried to vaccinate her against COVID, she would charge them with attempted murder. So now you know where BSVers are getting their legal advice. No, I'm not joking. Arthur, this idea of unfair judges and corrupt legal systems started with the Kleiman case when Magistrate Judge Reinhardt ruled against Wright, a ruling that was overturned by Judge Bloom, by the way, and has continued ever since. There seems to be a pattern between Craig Wright losing and the judge being biased, unfair, corrupt, or inexperienced. What do you make of the timing here? Craig Wright and his team is bullish right up until he hands over his evidence, and now suddenly we're hearing about corrupt judges.
Yeah, I guess the BSV camp is realizing that Craig's evidence is again not very credible and they are looking for someone to blame. Yeah, and that can be anyone except the hero, of course.
Oh yeah, of course, it's never Craig Wright's fault.
No, never.
In the interest of balance, some of us had issues with Judge Bloom and her kid-glove treatment of Craig Wright, which allowed him to get away with a huge amount of shithousery during the Kleiman trial. But did any of his opponents claim that she was corrupt?
No. I never heard this type of criticism, Mark. No.
On a related note, we learned something interesting from one of Wright's witness statements in the Pineapple Hack case in late 2023. Wright now blames his counsels for all of his courtroom failures. He blames Ontier for losing him the Peter McCormack case. He blames his, quote, Norwegian team, unquote, for losing him the Hodlonaut case. And he's also blamed Ontier again, before they were fired, for screwing up his only contemporaneous evidence in the Pineapple Hack case. So now Craig's got incompetent law firms and corrupt judges to contend with. How is he supposed to win when the odds are stacked against him like this?
Yeah, no, it's all part of his 5D chess game, Mark. I have been chatting a few times with BSV fans lately on Twitter, and more than once I hear them say that Craig is playing a sort of chess game and that he still has aces up his sleeves, things like that. But if he loses all his appeals too, then this story of corrupt judges will be used, of course, with Craig blaming his counsel in the months after. We've heard it all before. It's nothing new.
It's also worth reminding ourselves that the COPA case is the only one of some 9 British court cases involving Craig Wright in the last 5 years where he was not the litigant. In every other case, he's been more than happy to use the so-called corrupt legal system for his own benefit, so it can't be that bad. On the subject of law firms, Travers Smith was replaced by Shoesmiths in early October, having lasted just 3.5 months. Arthur, obviously we don't know why Travers Smith left Wright's orbit, but I think it's telling that they lasted a little over 15 weeks, in which time they had to endure both the Madden report and Christian Ager-Hansen's revelations within a week of which they were gone. Do you think this is significant?
Yeah, I think it is sort of significant indeed. Travers Smith was hired by Christian Ager-Hansen somewhere in the summer of 2023. Or at least he moved a few people in his network to get Craig a new lawyer after Craig and Ontier split up. But that relationship indeed didn't last long. Currently we don't know exactly who initiated that split between Craig and Travers Smith. But it wouldn't surprise me to find out that Travers Smith was... that they are not unhappy with the termination of this engagement.
No, I don't think so. And also, Craig Wright's biggest bone of contention is that his legal teams had the audacity to ignore his approach and go with their own, which is why he says he lost his trials. Do you think he's just been shopping around for anyone that will take his money and just do what he says?
Yeah, it appears like another possibly very important motivation for Craig Wright indeed. But also, to be fair, I think Craig will always bump his head in the end because he is so far always with rather large firms. And these large firms have a reputation to lose. Hence, they always have rather strict codes of conduct within their offices, on top of the industry codes of conduct, of course. And they will not blindly follow up on everything that Craig suggests or demands.
They're not going to breach any proper, codes of conduct or rules for him. But when it comes to the approach they're taking, they might just be really compliant with him.
They are also rather fresh, so maybe they are nodding yes all the time to him. And I mean, the real fireworks still has to come in this trial, of course. So, yeah, we have to see.
On the subject of bias, it's worth noting that the court appeared to forget to inform Wright's lawyers of the date of this late October hearing, leading to them not being present for it. And yet this open goal was completely missed by the corruption brigade. Honestly, their hearts aren't in it. Back to the case itself then. News of the Madden report began to leak out, at which point we started to get some opinions on the COPA case from Craig Wright's side, with explanations emerging over how the tampered documents came to be.
The option that is an option that people don't talk about a ton is maybe the stuff was tampered with without Craig's knowledge at some point between the Satoshi era, which would be like 2005 or 6 to 2010 or 12, and then when these images were taken, which is confusing.
Arthur, this comment really sums up the BSV way of thinking. They need to believe that someone else did it because otherwise their dream is shattered. But this throwaway comment that the stuff was tampered with intentionally underplays it. If you're going to believe that all these forgeries are the work of a malicious third party, which Craig has said in court that they were, then that means someone else created something like 400 plus fake documents, emails, handwritten notes, meeting minutes, business contracts, chat conversations, and more, including close to 50 Bitcoin white paper drafts, and left them all on his computers in the hope that one day they would be scraped for evidence without him ever noticing, or without them ever being caught. Now, this is crazy enough in itself, but the hackers would have to believe that Craig would, as we suggested, never carry out even the most rudimentary check of any evidence he recovers before it's sent away, which to date he never has. And this is despite apparently knowing as far back as 2014 that his systems had been compromised and this fake material planted. And yet he's still over the moon when he finds all this new evidence, which turns out to be forged. Craig Wright wants us to only talk about evidence, so okay, where is the evidence that anyone at any time ever compromised his systems? He's given us plenty of names, plenty of theories, but we've never seen one shred of evidence, not any fingerprint, digital or physical, to point to a third party planting anything on his system, let alone 400 plus documents. I don't know what to say to these people anymore. Something else we learned in this video is exactly how COPA is going to get hold of those valuable nChain patents.
Like when you take some of the richest people in the history of the world who have gotten very rich by controlling data, they look at someone like Craig and Calvin and say, okay, we have deeper pockets than them. We'll just paper them to death until we win. Could totally happen. Or, push them basically into bankruptcy and then we buy nChain and then we control them anyways. Like this could be, who knows?
Arthur, this is the first time I've actually heard a theory about how COPA is going to avail itself of Craig Wright's patents. And of course, they both involve borderline conspiracy theories about what might happen in the future. But the big question that these patent freaks aren't asking themselves is, why would COPA want nChain's patents? I mean, would you go to all this trouble and effort if you were COPA?
No, of course not. There seems to be this assumption that because Craig's name is on so many patents that he must be Satoshi, but these patents have been assessed by industry experts a few years ago, and they said that the portfolio of nChain has a technical relevance of 0.00. So in other words, they are worthless junk. Basically, it's delusional to think that someone is desperately after these junk patents of nChain by suing Craig Wright instead of going straight away to nChain to try bankrupt them and then take the patents directly. I mean, even if COPA wins on all counts, which I expect them to do actually, but then no nChain is touched, let alone their patents. The only thing that is likely to happen is that the patents lose their Satoshi bonus value, well, which they didn't have anyway, as no one believes Craig is Satoshi. But consider this, Mark. Wouldn't COPA be more interested in patents with a Satoshi bonus, right? So, I think that are the things that make you go, right?
Well, I mean, this was the whole point of the 2016 signing sessions and that whole deal, wasn't it? Because the patents go hand in hand with him being Satoshi. So yeah, they would have a greater value if that were the case.
Mm-hmm. But again, this is so far-fetched, because the COPA versus Craig Wright lawsuit is not about patents, not at all.
If things were looking bad for Craig Wright at this point, they were about to get much, much worse. On October 30th, COPA filed its amended particulars of claim, in which it added several new strings to its bow, including its top 50 forgeries. Before this, however, it added information on the life rights deal Craig Wright signed with a company called EITC Holdings in 2015, and which led to Andrew O'Hagan taking him apart in the Satoshi affair. Wright, incidentally, now categorises this as a work of fiction, and says that the deal was in fact to cover the formation of nChain, naturally. The appendix to the filing was the real meat, however. This contained a list of 50 of Wright's reliance documents, which COPA's analyst had shown to be forgeries, before adding, quote, "It is to be inferred, A, that Wright is responsible for the alteration of or tampering with these documents, whether by carrying them out himself or having others do so at his direction or with his knowledge, or at least, B, that he is aware of the alteration or tampering. In these circumstances, it is also to be inferred that the purpose of these acts was to create documents that would be deployed to prove that Wright is Satoshi." Unquote. COPA then laid out in full its top 50 forgeries submitted by Wright, along with a rather important note. Quote, "Following receipt of Dr. Wright's disclosure, COPA wrote to Dr. Wright to inform him that it was likely to raise allegations of forgery in respect of his disclosure, and to request access to the devices or forensic images from which the documents were obtained. Dr. Wright refused COPA's request to allow for inspection of the devices or forensic images from which the documents were obtained, despite the evident value of such inspection, as now attested by the experts of both parties in forensic document examination." Unquote. So Arthur, here we have the experts on both sides saying how important it was for Craig Wright to allow COPA to examine for itself the devices containing the evidence, and yet he refused. Now, we don't have a reason given for this by Craig Wright, but the subtext is pretty clear, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. Craig knows that more damning evidence of forgeries will be found, so of course he wouldn't like it that his devices will be forensically inquired.
In its introduction to the top 50 forgeries, COPA noted that Wright has also, quote, "sought to disclaim responsibility for the documents previously designated by him as reliance documents, including through his provision of extended chain of custody information he had previously refused to supply even in more basic form, in which he has, for the first time, suggested that the documents were handled by many unidentified further persons. He has thus sought to distance himself from documents only once their veracity has been called into question, unquote. This is not dissimilar to the Pineapple hack case again, where Wright withdrew critical evidence when it was found to be bunk and then blamed his lawyers and his ex-wife. COPA also added that Wright, quote, has provided implausible explanations for alteration and tampering with documents and has raised factual allegations previously said by him to be irrelevant. These are new explanations which are the more implausible because Dr. Wright has had the relevant documents for many years and has disclosed and or deployed many of them in previous proceedings without previously giving these explanations, unquote. And thirdly, to a point we've already made, quote, furthermore, it is inconsistent with Dr. Wright's own account of his technical skill in computer security that he did not identify document alterations or reasons for documents to be unreliable before the service of the Madden report, unquote. Arthur, we're here at last, COPA's top 50 forgeries. Now, sadly, we haven't got time to go through all 50, so let's do what we did for the KPMG report in the Hodlonaut trial and go for your top 5, starting with your number 5.
Okay, let's go. Yeah. Now, there is so much to say about all those forgeries, but and forgive me the order. I mean, this one could be on 4, on 2, on 3. It's certainly not on number 1, but I put it on number 5. It's a Project Blacknet paper, and I will quote from the Madden 50 report. The document contains references to a Stage 4 release phase and other textual amendments referring to digital cash, as well as other features of purported relevance to Bitcoin. However, the internal metadata for the document indicate that it was actually created on February the 17th of 2014. The document is an edited version of an earlier document into which passages of text have been inserted using text from the Bitcoin white paper. And Mark, what I like so much about this forgery is that it shows how Craig started to forge his Satoshi evidence in 2014, which is actually the first year of his cosplay.
I mean, isn't that like 3 days after he emailed Louis Kleiman? Was it Valentine's Day? It's right around that time, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. We know from January a few emails that he spoofed from a Satoshi email address. So that was his first careful steps in the cosplay arena. And in February he started to come out a little bit more by contacting Ira Kleiman, and that was in February indeed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so take us through your next one.
The next one is an LLM dissertation dated in 2007, and I quote, which contains language similar to that found in the Bitcoin white paper. Again, meaning there are pieces of text that appear to be Bitcoin white paper quotes. And to cut a long story short, there was indeed a genuine Craig Wright 2007 dissertation, but without the Bitcoin white paper quotes and language, of course. So they found Grammarly software evidence in the metadata that suggested that the dissertation was edited in 2019. And then this, and I quote again, the document has an implausible edit time in excess of 131 days, consistent with the use of clock manipulation techniques. So what I like so much about this forgery is that it pinpoints a very important year for Craig, where he needed to come up with a lot of these new forgeries in his lawsuits. So very productive years for Craig with regards to these forgeries were 2014 and then 2019 again.
So these are 2 documents then that he created all these years ago, but he's never used for anything? Is that this is the first time they've been made public, is that right?
No, yeah, sort of. He has been playing around, and if you follow him over the years, you will see that he puts things online. He will drop in his Slack room sometimes this type of evidence, see if it sticks with his fans. So we know about those things sometimes, and of course it's called out most of the times beforehand already, but here we see it in full glory, so to say, and then judged by an forensic expert.
Okay, and your third favorite?
Now, that is a white paper draft. That is where he changed the title from Bitcoin to Timecoin. Yeah. And that is dated in 6th of May 2008. And also in the metadata, I think they found all the dates up to the 12th of December of 2008. And Dr. Wright, let me check. Yeah, Dr. Wright states its approximate date to be 6th of May 2008 in his chain of custody information. The document has been backdated. That is what the Madden report says. Rather than being a precursor document to the Bitcoin white paper as it purports to be, this document has been created from the Bitcoin white paper subsequently and edited in such a way that it appears as if it was precursor work. Among much more, the document irregularly contains words throughout in which hyphens ought to appear but are missing. This is not consistent with ordinary dictation or typing error, but is as an artifact of conversion from PDF and backdating. Now, and what I like very much about this forgery is that you can see Craig Wright trying to be creative in a desperate attempt to come across as the real Satoshi. Satoshi never used the word Timecoin, and Craig is hoping that bringing up such a new angle in Bitcoin history is giving him extra credibility. And yeah, that would probably have worked if it wasn't called out as a forgery again.
Like much of his evidence.
Yeah.
If it wasn't faked, it'd be great.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to your second favourite.
Here I really started to make choices because I wanted to have a number one that is really a number one to me. Mm-hmm. So another one is number two, and those are the spoofed emails from Satoshi at vistomail.com. And what we see here, they come from January 2014. That was the first month that he started his cosplay, and he produced a few of those emails. We know several of them now. And what does Madden say? The email was recorded in its transmission header as being for Craig at rcjbr.org and delivered to Craig at rcjbr.org. Now, so that is the spoofing trick that he has been doing. It was not retrieved from the mailbox of Satoshi Nakamoto, but a received item from within Dr. Wright's personal email inbox, consistent with him being included as a blind copy, BCC, recipient. Mm-hmm. Now, what I like very much about these spoofed emails is that they mark what I already said, the beginning of Craig's Satoshi roleplay, which was January 2014. Of course, Craig might have thought about his roleplay in 2013 already, when he was fooling around with random whale addresses and falsely claiming that they were his, but his Satoshi roleplay really ramped up the Craig Wright saga to where we are now. Now, in his carefully orchestrated little attempts in small private circles to test the waters were these spoofed emails to a few people. And in February, we just discussed it already, in February 2014, he ramped up the cosplay show and dragged Climate Estate on stage, as most will know.
Indeed. Okay, so we've had your top four. What's your favourite forgery from the Madden 50?
I wanted to put the forged credit card payment here, but it is not in the Madden report. But it is still a beautiful story, because we now know about 3 times that he tried something with the credit card. One time in his blog, failed. One time it was delivered, but it was again a forgery from Reddit. We discussed it before. Mm-hmm. And then he delivered a bunch of credit card payments, and they could not find anything.
It's just a bunch of random supermarket shops that he's done.
Yeah. Here are some credit card payments. You can find it in here. Nobody could ever find it, and not even himself. What did end up on the Meta 50 list was one of the hex-edited Bitcoin exe files, and this example was dated January the 4th of 2009, version 008 Alpha, copyright 2008, Dr. Craig Wright. But because it was hex-edited instead of compiled new, its internal checksum was not matching the file, and it turned out that the checksum is an exact copy of the checksum for the authentic Bitcoin.exe, but from version 011. And that was genuinely released by Satoshi on January the 10th. in 2009. So yeah, that was a blunder of by Craig Wright from here to Tokyo and back.
That's funny.
But
that's not even the one.
That is not even a one. No, again, just giving you a few examples of how I discuss these things with myself.
Mm-hmm.
Nee, my number one, this forgery has an amazing story due to its history and trail of custody. In 2019, Craig showed a piece of paper in front of the webcam for a reporter of Modern Consensus Media. And he told that reporter, Brendan Sullivan, that it was a piece of paper dated January 2008 with some handwritten text by Craig himself on it, and that marked the start of the name Satoshi Nakamoto. That's what Craig Wright claimed, at least. And Brandon posted several screenshots from that webcam session, and you guessed it, the Bitcoin community started to zoom in on these images, and they found several flaws in the document. For example, the year 2008 contained two different fonts. One font for the 20 half that appeared as the genuine font, and another font for the 08 half. So yeah, that was a clear indication that someone, and that someone of course being Craig Wright, had been fooling around with the 08 part of the year. So that paper forgery was talk of the town for a few days. But then this exact same forgery popped up in the KPMG forensic report in the Hodl Not Norway case in 2022. And KPMG managed to present even more details why this exact same paper, with the handwritten text of Craig Wright on it, was a forgery. So mind you, Craig creates a forgery in 2019, shows it on camera in 2019, it gets called out straight away, but still he is using it to file in a lawsuit 2 years later. And then it doesn't end there, because you would think that Craig would not make the same mistake again, right? That he should realize by now that the whole world knows that that paper is a forgery.
He should.
But, shock horror, the same paper with the handwritten notes of Craig on it about the foundational moment that the Satoshi Nakamoto pseudonym was chosen, according to Craig, also popped up in the COPA case. And we find it in the Madden 50 report as forgery number 45, with the exact same findings as the Bitcoin community and the KPMG forensics. Yeah, I find such a thing simply wild, truly amazing.
Okay, well, as I said, we haven't got time to go through the full Madden 50, but that's a lovely little taster of the sort of thing that's in there, and hopefully at the trial we'll have even more of those little nuggets brought out and discussed, and we can have a good laugh over those in a few months' time.
Yep.
Something else that's important to mention here, something that Stealthy Excellent pointed out on Reddit and that I wasn't aware of. The 50 forgeries isn't some kind of cap that's been imposed by COPA. It was simply a limit on the number of additional allegations of forgery that was allowed to be added to the original complaint. So if Craig Wright tries to use a piece of evidence outside of those 50 to back up a point, COPA can still use the Madden report, and anything else it wants really, to rebuff it. The importance of the 50 documents is that Justice Mellor is going to go through each of them and the expert evidence on both sides and rule on whether he thinks they're forgeries or not and who forged them, and that's how he's going to come to his decision on the forgery claim. Now, before the identity trial, Craig Wright would have had to have perhaps just 1 or 2 bits of evidence ruled as genuine for COPA's claim to be dismissed, but with this altered dynamic, he's in a much worse position, isn't he?
Yeah, of course, I think he is. Given the filings that we have seen so far, the numerous witness statements, and let's not forget the Madden Top 50 report about Craig's forgeries. Yeah, and make no mistake, COPA is accusing Craig Wright of creating all these forgeries. And they certainly don't take Craig's excuses for granted. So those are very serious accusations. And what we see is that they have the material to back up these accusations. We can also see that the judge, who of course will never admit that at this stage, is in general not on the side of Craig Wright, as it appears to me. And the reason I think that is because Justice Mellor so far honors all the security for cost requests against Craig Wright, and the recent adding of Craig a fraud determination and ruling to the COPA case is very telling to me. It means that COPA has convinced Mellor that there are certainly merits to this question.
Well, I'm assuming it takes quite a convincing case to convince a judge to look at something like intentional fraud in such a serious setting. And the fact that he's agreed to it shows that, as you say, their case is, in his eyes, has definitely got merit.
Yeah, no, that's what I think also.
Wright's supporters tried their best to search for the nuggets of gold flying at them through the shitstorm, so let's try for their benefit. One well-known Craig Wright apologist on Twitter claimed that, quote, COPA, in a possible oversight in its accusation, brings to light a document that could definitively prove that Craig is Satoshi, unquote, and gave this explanation. Quote, in a confusing analysis, COPA seems to have hung itself with its own rope when it claims that an altered document containing a portion of the Bitcoin white paper was changed in the year 2005. Do they know that Bitcoin was publicly released after that? In other words, even if Dr. Craig had altered this document, it would still be definitive proof that he is Satoshi, because this was done before the Bitcoin launch and he had access to specific excerpts of the white paper before it was publicly released. Arthur, is he right?
No, of course not. I see that so many times. This is what you get when you only read 10% of a filing. Every now and then I make a little mistake also, but I try to read the whole filing before I try to make and judge what is going on. What happened here, this is about one of the Madden top 50 forgeries, where Patrick Madden proves that Craig took an October 2005 document without Bitcoin references. Then he inserted some Bitcoin white paper quotes, he saved it and changed some of the metadata of this newly created document to September 2005, 1 month earlier. And what this individual on Twitter missed is the crucial sentence, it contains hidden embedded content indicated that the content was copied directly from the Bitcoin white paper and which has then been added away to appear to be precursor content. And what he also missed is that the signature date of this September 2005 forgery had a signature date in the future, October 2005, which is technically impossible.
In the wake of COPA's filing, we got some even weirder takes from the BSV community over what was going to happen next. Quote, my take on the COPA versus Wright coming up trial. Craig loses, gives more time to the crypto cartel and BTC Ponzi scheme, repeals and wins. Unquote. The same genius gave this explanation when asked about his interesting theory. Quote, listen, there is a lot of corrupt entities standing against Craig. I don't need to mention their names. Craig fights the devil himself, BlackRock, so I don't expect it to be easy for him, not because the irrefutable evidence, but because these are powerful people. But they'll lose. Unquote. Arthur, is BlackRock involved in the COPA case?
No, not at all. What this individual probably mixed up is that BlackRock is in the process of trying to get a Bitcoin spot ETF approved, and so this obviously puts them into the anti-BSV cartel. And no doubt we will hear of them being in league with COPA and the exchange cartel in time.
The BSV subreddit was, of course, full of hot takes, including this one. Quote, if Craig's main goal was to win against COPA, then he would sign. Any judge would feel comfortable when this was combined with other evidence that Craig Wright is in fact Satoshi. The judge would have a good excuse to rule in Craig's favour. In general, people would accept the judge got it right. However, if Craig's main goal is not to win, but to teach the judge that signatures don't prove identity, then not signing is the way to go, even if it means Craig loses. Also, the documents don't prove it either. Unquote. Arthur, this is the case that will define Craig Wright's life. What on earth makes these people think that his goal might not be to win it?
Yeah, good one. These people have somehow an unhealthy trust that all will be all right, whatever happens. And we're seeing more and more people saying that Craig will somehow lose on purpose. Yeah, this is pure cope, if you ask me. And I can tell you that no person involved in any lawsuit, whether it's for £5 or £5 million, actively chooses to lose it. Of course, the result isn't going to change the minds of many people who already know about this case. Kelvin Ayre isn't going to certainly say that Craig isn't Satoshi if he loses. And, well, you know me, Mark, I'm not going to change my mind if he wins, unless he signs a block or sends some coins like he was supposed to do in 2016. In the end, it's just the judge's opinion, and there is so much evidence that we know about going back to 2006 that the judge won't get to hear. But yes, in answer to your question, if he loses, there is not a chance in hell that he meant to.
The allegations of forgeries were dismissed by more of Wright's supporters, who shrugged it off, calling it a nothing burger, and remained almost obtusely bullish in the wake of COPA's claims. CoinGeek tried to distract away from the issue by writing a piece calling COPA rotten to the core after one member, Kraken, was charged with securities fraud by the SEC, a message that was backed by equally sane takes.
And I believe Craig Wright is going to win this trial. And even if he doesn't win the trial, I believe that BSV is the original Bitcoin protocol, and BTC is a pump and dump fraud scam by the BTC Core community, by Square, by Coinbase, by Binance. It is a multifaceted fraud perpetuated by the media and governments of the world, calling BTC scam. BTC is not Bitcoin. BTC is a goddamn fraud.
Goddamn governments, when will they stop promoting Bitcoin? November was fairly quiet on the COPA front, with both teams preparing for a 2-day pre-trial hearing in mid-December, and Wright preoccupied with getting a certain part of his anatomy handed to him in the Pineapple Hack case. The hearing would prove no less dramatic than those that had come before it, with revelations over Craig Wright's found hard drives being the cherry on the cake. These will be the subject of our 4th episode in this series. I know, but the guy just can't stop. But Arthur, I believe you spotted a gem in Craig's witness statement regarding the Genesis block.
Yeah, I found this in Craig's 4th witness statement, and I tell you what, Mark, if anything proves that Craig Wright is not Satoshi Nakamoto, it's something like this. This is comparable with Craig Wright not knowing that Bitcoin public addresses have checksum built in, as Roger Ver once found out in 2018, which was the moment he knew that Craig is a fraud and not Satoshi. So, okay, bear with me. I'll read a little piece of Craig's witness statement so you understand what he is saying.
Mm-hmm.
I've never asserted that I can prove that I used the Satoshi Nakamoto pseudonym by reference to the Genesis block. It is also unclear what's meant by me having control over Satoshi's private key and the Genesis block. There is no such thing as the Satoshi private key, and I do not understand how anyone could profess to have control over the Genesis block. By way of explanation, the Genesis block was created, not mined. No, he's actually sort of right there. The 50 Bitcoin associated with the Genesis block was not designed to be withdrawn. That is correct also. As such, it has zero value. It follows that there never was a private key associated with the block. Expressed another way, it is a fact that the Genesis block does not have and never had a private key. End of quote. Now, and this last part is what makes me giggle for more than a bit. Because, Mark, this is Bitcoin 101 stuff. It really is. And let's just read that again. It is a fact that the Genesis block does not have and never had a private key. Now, I will go back to basics here because Craig is forcing me to, but Bitcoin's Genesis block has a public address which is starting with 1A1Z. And this public address is created in a 2-step process. And you don't have to believe me, I will quote from Andreas Antonopoulos' book Mastering Bitcoin. It says, the private key is a number usually picked at random. From the private key, we use elliptic curve multiplication, a one-way cryptographic function, to generate a public key. And from the public key, we use a one-way cryptographic hash function to generate a Bitcoin public address. Now, so because the Bitcoin Genesis block has a public key, it must therefore have a private key. And no one in the history of Bitcoin has ever suggested that it didn't. So I have no idea how Craig would try and back this up in court, but it will fail instantly between the experts that are going to discuss this with him.
Well, I really hope he gets the chance to try and explain that, because that would be quite something to hear on the stand.
Remember that Charlie Lee of Litecoin, he signed once the Litecoin Genesis block in 2016 to show Craig the way how it should be. Litecoin is a direct copy of Bitcoin set up in 2011. And of course, there are a few differences, some faster block time and 4 times more coins, and a different hashing algorithm. But for the rest, it's the basic. It's the same code as Bitcoin, and the same type of Genesis block with a public and a private key. So Charlie Lee once signed the Genesis block. Now, and that is also possible with the Bitcoin Genesis block, of course.
Now, we're nearly done here, but in the last episode we talked about Calvin Ayre's email in which he says to Craig, "We will say that we believe you did forge some documents to replace ones you destroyed earlier to try and pretend you were Satoshi." Now, in the next episode, we're not going to get the excuse of replacing destroyed documents, but we are going to see evidence being replaced, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. Listeners will probably know by now that Craig magically found a couple of hard drives with heaps of new material on them, which will allow him to replace some of the already debunked evidence with new evidence. And yeah, Mark, as the song goes, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Oh, indeed. Well, I'm greatly looking forward to that, and thank you for your thoughts and insight for this episode.
As always, you're welcome, Mark.
I'll see you for the next one.
Cheers, mate.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Dr. Bitcoin, the man who wasn't Satoshi Nakamoto. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice to get these episodes the moment they drop, and if you enjoyed what you heard, we'd really appreciate a star rating and even a review to help us get this out to as many people as possible. Our monthly bonus episodes are available to download from our website for a small consideration, and if you'd like to access all these bonus episodes, plus these monthly updates a few days early and other goodies, you can do so by becoming a Dr. Bitcoin supporter. See the details in the show notes for information on how to do this, or head to our website drbitcoinpod.com. That's drbitcoinpod.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at drbitcoinpod, and you can email us at drbitcoinpod@gmail.com. That's drbitcoinpod@gmail.com. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll speak to you again soon.
You've been listening to Dr. Bitcoin, the man who wasn't Satoshi Nakamoto. Written by Mark Hunter, with additional material by Arthur Van Pelt. Editing and production by Mark Hunter. This has been a Contented Media production.